You were made to write, not to fight, not to destroy, not to carve a gash in the hull of a century and watch the world flood through it. You were made for desks and drawing rooms and the quiet, civilized act of putting words on paper. You were a fountain pen, black lacquer, gold nib, the kind of instrument that cost more than a factory worker earned in a week. You were made in the early 20th century, an era that believed, genuinely and deeply, that civilization had progressed beyond its darkest instincts, that the age of mass slaughter was behind it, that men of education and refinement, sitting around tables, could solve with words what their predecessors had solved with blood. You were the physical embodiment of that belief. You were filled with ink, black, permanent, the color of decisions that cannot be undone. The nib that would touch paper had been ground to a perfect point. You moved smoothly. You did not skip or catch or bleed. You were reliable, precise. You were everything the men who would use you believed themselves to be. You were wrong. So were they. Before you could matter, the world had to break, and it broke completely. 4 years, 17 million dead, the first industrialized mass slaughter in human history. Men fed into trenches and machine guns and poison gas with the efficiency of a factory processing raw materials. Empires that had stood for centuries collapsed in months. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire. 4 dynasties that had shaped the world for generations, gone. The men who survived, the ones who came back from the mud and the wire and the darkness, came back changed in ways that their families could not recognize and their governments did not want to acknowledge. They had seen what modern weapons did to human bodies. They had breathed air that burned. They had watched their friends die in ways that had no dignity and no meaning. They were promised it would be the last time. The war to end all wars, that was what they called it, not with cynicism, with desperate, exhausted hope. The belief that humanity, having seen what it was capable of, would recoil from it permanently, that the sheer scale of the catastrophe would function as a lesson. It needed an ending, a formal, permanent, written ending. That is where you came in. June 28, 1919, Versailles, France. The Hall of Mirrors, 240 feet long, 17 arched mirrors reflecting 17 arched windows overlooking the gardens of the most famous palace in the world. Built by Louis XIV as a monument to French power and glory, now repurposed as the room where the war would officially end. The irony was not lost on anyone. The last time this room had been used for a ceremony of this magnitude was in 1871, when the German Empire had been proclaimed here, in the heart of France, after Prussia's humiliating defeat of the French. 48 years later, the positions were reversed. Germany was defeated. France was host. The wheel had turned. The German delegates entered looking like men walking to their own execution. They were not entirely wrong. The treaty they were about to sign had been written without them, negotiated by the victorious powers, France, Britain, the United States, Italy, over 6 months of argument and compromise and revenge. The Germans had been presented with it as a fait accompli, sign or face renewed war. There was no negotiation, there was no discussion. You were placed on the table. The room was silent. The mirrors reflected everything. The delegates, the diplomats, the journalists, the photographers, the weight of 17 million dead compressed into a single moment of ink on paper. You were ready. The signatures took hours. Not because anyone hesitated, the outcome was never in doubt, but because there were many signatories, many pages, many copies. The machinery of international diplomacy moved slowly and formally, with the careful deliberateness of people who understood that what they were creating would be studied for generations. You moved across the paper, name after name, delegate after delegate, the representatives of France, Britain, the United States, Italy, Japan, Belgium, Brazil, the nations that had won, and then the Germans, Johannes Bell and Hermann Müller, signing on behalf of a nation that had not been allowed to negotiate the terms of its own surrender. The ink you left was black and permanent. You did not know what it meant. You were a pen. You recorded pressure. You translated the movement of a hand into marks on paper. But the marks you made that day contained everything. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany accepts sole responsibility for causing the war. Germany pays reparations. Germany loses territory. Germany's military is reduced to 100,000 men. Germany is humiliated, formally, permanently, in writing, in front of the world.
The Germans called it the Diktat, the dictated peace, not a negotiated settlement, but an imposed punishment. They signed because they had no choice, and they never forgot.
The treaty was meant to prevent another war. It created one. The reparations were crushing, 132 billion gold marks, a number so large that Germany would not finish paying it until 2010. Yes, 2010. The last payment on the Versailles Treaty was made 91 years after you touched paper. The territorial losses carved Germany into pieces. The war guilt clause did something more dangerous than take land or money. It took dignity. It told an entire nation, formally and permanently, that they were to blame, that their suffering was their own fault, that the world had judged them and found them guilty. Into that wound walked a man with a voice like a wound itself. He had been a soldier, a corporal, a man who had breathed the gas and survived the trenches and come back to a Germany that felt humiliated and betrayed and desperate for someone to blame. He understood, instinctively and completely, that the treaty you had made possible was the most powerful recruiting tool anyone could have given him. He stood in beer halls and shouted about the diktat, about the betrayal, about the stab in the back, about the day Germany would tear up the paper you had signed and take back what was taken from it. People listened. More people listened. And then, 20 years after you touched paper in the Hall of Mirrors, the world broke again, worse than before, more completely, with weapons that made the trenches of the First War look like a rehearsal. 60 million dead. You had signed the peace. You had started the war. The treaty itself survived, physically. Document paper is more durable than the intentions written on it. It sits today in the French diplomatic archives, preserved, catalogued, studied by historians who have spent careers trying to understand how a document designed to end war became the blueprint for a larger one. The debate has never stopped. Some historians argue that the treaty was not harsh enough, that a more complete German defeat, a more total occupation, would have prevented the resentment that followed. Others argue it was too harsh, that a more generous peace, one that treated Germany as a nation to be reintegrated rather than punished, would have removed the fuel that fed the fire. John Maynard Keynes, the economist who attended the Paris Peace Conference and resigned in protest, wrote a book that year called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He predicted, with uncomfortable precision, exactly what would happen. That the reparations were unpayable, that the humiliation was unsustainable, that the treaty was not a peace, but a 20-year armistice. He was right by 1 year. The Second World War began 20 years and 2 months after you touched paper. You did not know any of this. You were a pen. You recorded what you were asked to record. You moved where you were directed to move. But you were there, in the Hall of Mirrors, in the silence before the signatures, in the moment when the world believed it was ending one thing and was actually beginning another. You have thought about this for over 100 years. Not with regret. Pens do not feel regret, but with the specific weight of an object that was present at the precise moment when the future was written, and knows, in whatever way objects know things, that the future written was not the one intended. The men who held you believed they were being rational. They were exhausted and grieving and desperate for security, and they made the calculations that exhausted, grieving, desperate people make, calculations that feel like justice in the moment and reveal themselves as revenge only in retrospect. They wanted Germany to pay. Germany paid, and the payment became a humiliation, and the humiliation became a movement, and the movement became a war, and the war killed 60 million people. The mathematics of punishment do not work the way punishers believe they will. You know this now. You knew nothing then. You were filled with ink and placed on a table and moved across paper, and the marks you left were permanent, and the permanence was the problem. Peace requires generosity. It requires the willingness to let the defeated nation recover, rebuild, reintegrate, to become part of the world again rather than a wound in the side of it. Lincoln understood this about the American South. He was killed before he could act on it. The men at Versailles understood the opposite. They acted on it completely. And you were the instrument. Not the cause, never the cause,
The pen does not write the words, the hand does. The hand does not form the words, the mind does. The mind does not conceive the words alone. History, fear, grief, and the ancient human hunger for retribution conceive them together. You were just the last step. But you were there. In the Hall of Mirrors, on the 28th of June, 1919, in the silence before the first signature, you held everything that was about to happen. The peace that wasn't, the war that was, the 60 million who would die because the men who held you believed that humiliation was the same thing as resolution. You signed the peace, you started the war, and the ink has never dried.